Thanks, everybody. I just want to welcome you again to the 2021 Sports Performance Summit, sponsored by Penn State Intercollegiate Athletics. My name is Michael Gay. I'm an athletic trainer with Penn State University. Our next presentation is going to be based on professional communication. The presentation is going to be led by Keith Embray, Associate Athletic Director for Student Welfare Development, and Dr. Natalie DePalma, clinical psychologist, serves with counseling and psychological services here at Penn State, and Dr. Carl Ohlson, who's in charge of performance psychology here at Penn State. So again, just as a reminder, the summit's been set up as a Zoom meeting to encourage everyone to collaborate and talk and really formulate community across Penn State athletics. So to limit distractions to our speakers, please hold all questions until the end and minimize the use of the chat function during the lecture. There'll be some time following the presentation for questions. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers. Thank you very much.
Big Mike, thank you, sir. I'm very appreciative of you, brother, all you do for our student athletes and our cross country and track and field team. And you are literally out on the track, sweltering and baking right now. So I appreciate the intro, brother, really do. I have one quick question. Is there at any time in your life where you had to wear a pair of pants besides maybe when you were married?
It's always shorts weather, man. It's always short.
I'm just in 5 years, brother. You holding a hell of a record right now. I've never seen you in a full pair of pants. That might sound bad if somebody just jumped into the call. There's context. We're talking about communication. With that being said, thank you, folks, and welcome to day two of the knowledge and wisdom train. And yeah, I will have those all day, folks, so just be prepared. We started off with the train, we got the engine, and now we got the caboose that's pulling it together so we all can get where we need to get. But I'm ecstatic and very happy to be presenting with these two wonderful folks about something that we all know about, we all have to do, we all have to use, but for some reason, why are there gaps? Why are there miscommunications? Why is our intent sometimes not what we wanted the impact to be? And so throughout the course of our presentation, there's essentially three components that will address how we communicate, the very basics of it in a lot of ways, because we need to have a foundation and a base to start from and talk from. And then we'll have an additional section to where we'll get into some scenarios and things that, depending on your position, whether you're a coach, whether you're a person in other positions of leadership, and how do you communicate with those who you're charged with leading. And then finally, you know, we would be remiss not to be able to pull these things together and have you understand the human side of this, the human side, the empathy side, that's essential and necessary to not only be professional, but to be effective communicators. So with that being said, like I said, we're gonna get this started. And next slide for me, please. Thank you so much, Natalie. I'm not gonna read it to you, but I love this quote. And as you read this, you know, by a show of feet, okay, I'm just seeing if anybody's paying attention right now. Somebody actually went to put their foot up. Good thing we all got the cameras off right now. But you know, how many people does this resonate with? Because I know every time I read it, it resonates with me. I know anybody on this call that we understand what this means. But why does it happen? Next slide, please. So I love this little quick picture because I'm going to make an assumption that the majority of us believe we are the minion in the middle, right? And everybody else is either not paying attention, they didn't listen to me, I know what I said, you just didn't hear what you needed to hear. Right? So again, we're talking about professional communication with the ultimate goal of always making sure that it's effective, our intent versus our impact. Next slide, please. And because we all learn differently, and I know we've had two previous presentations that have been tremendous, and the brain is going and thinking about some other things, but we're gonna do a little what we call priming with Dr. Ohlson. He's like, yeah, Keith, you listen to me, right? What are Revis puzzles? These are essentially little pictures, often made with letters and words, which cryptically represent a word, a phrase, or even a saying. So we're just gonna have just a handful of these, just quick things to get the mind, get the fluids flowing in the brain. So if we're looking at the one on the screen right now, what do you think this represents? What do you think it's trying to communicate? I'm really just gonna have you give it a second, take a look at it. And then here's the answer for this first Revis puzzle, right? Fat chance. Right? So the letters, if you look at the letters, you look at the size of the letters. And again, we're talking about communication. Puzzle number 1. So here we go. Let's be ready. Let's get locked in. And now I'm gonna give you another one. Some people are like, ah, come on. Give me something I can work with. Okay? But the answer to this is first aid. And the interesting thing, even with this Revis puzzle, is it's probably how we feel when we have said, or someone has said something to us that did not land well. Is we're looking for something or somebody to come in and fix this or somebody to repair this. We're gonna keep it moving. Here's number 2. Keep it going, make sure you locked in. So again, remember, it can be a message, it can be a phrase, it can be a word, but you gotta look at the totality of it. Answer, please. Once in a blue moon. And around the topic of communication, how many times do a number of us feel that way when we maybe have to present, when we have to prepare to get in front of other people, and it's literally like once in a blue moon? So maybe that's another reason why the communication piece, and especially when we're in positions of leadership, doesn't always resonate, right? Because it may not be something we have to do all the time, but in reality, we do all the time. And the next one, please. It's one of my favorite ones. So we give a little bit of time. Thank you from the wonderful community that the answers are appearing. So we have a little bit of delay. See technology. I appreciate y'all. Thank y'all so much. But it's all good. Misunderstood. And is this not the place that nobody wants to be when we talk about communication or miscommunications? That feeling of being misunderstood, that feeling of what I went to send is not how it landed. So with that being said, next slide. I want to give us a baseline and a very simplistic and a very quick definition of communication. So the act or process of using words, sounds, signs, or behaviors to express, exchange ideals, thoughts, feelings, etc. That's a very simple, quick definition of when we say what is it to communicate? And because we all learn different, some of us are visual, some of us are auditory, some of us are kinetic. The next slide I want to share with you, and anybody's communications major, you better, I'm gonna have a quick quiz on this and where did this come from, but essentially to give this some visual substance. And they refer to this as the effective communication cycle. So there is sender and receiver, and then here are the components. And every time we interact with somebody, this is what happens. There is a message formulated. It's encoded. We send it. The receiver decodes it, starts to interpret it. And then his or her feedback lets you know what they got from the message. So the effective communication cycle, this is something we all engage in. This is something we all do. But again, where's potential opportunities for things to be missed or misinterpreted or not understood? Next slide, please. So many ways to communicate. I'm not going to labor this. Miss Natalie hit us with it. Verbally, non-verbally, written, interpersonal, mass. That's just to name a few ways that we communicate. And this is on a daily basis. So again, I want you to think about that cycle. And I want you to think about so many different ways to communicate. But at the end of the day, what just popped up on our screen right now is one of the most underutilized or undertrained things, and arguably one of the most valuable, which is listening. We focus a lot on sending and receiving and interpreting, but what about this component of listening? To accurately receive and interpret messages in the communication process. And I want to give you some things to think about with this listening thing that is not listening. And also some things associated with listening that will also help us. So Ms. Natalie, if you can just roll them out for me, I appreciate it. And we'll break them down as you roll them out and we'll work our way through them. Listening is not the same as hearing. Have we heard that before? Listening is not the same as hearing. Stop talking. So if you are talking, you are not listening, you are not prepared to engage. You are potentially on the defensive. Do we ever consider making sure to put the speaker at ease to help them effectively communicate? Remove distractions. I can't emphasize this enough. Every time we glance down at that cell phone, every time we glance off to the screen and we're on a Zoom call and all 10 million people can see us looking at another screen, that's a distraction. Those result in breaks in the communication cycle. Listen to the tone. Right? The tone is very valuable. Right? I love all of you. I probably think you don't believe that. Right? Listen to the tone. Wait, watch for nonverbal communication. And that leads into one of my last slides, these 3 levels of effective communications. The words you use, the tone you take, and the language of your body. And I really want you to think about those 3 things. It's not only the words that we choose, it's not only the tone we take, and it's not just our body language. It is typically, and more often than not, a combination of all for the message to be sent, encoded, and to get the feedback that you're looking for. So with that being said, I'm gonna make sure and transition into this wonderful gentleman. We have one more Revis puzzle before we transition into Dr. Ohlson, and I want you to think about this. Just take a quick look at it. See these words. Okay. Miss Natalie, you hit us with our answer for this. Too little, too late. And how often do we feel that way, again, when there was a miscommunication or misinterpretation? And as I transition into Dr. Ohlson, I want you to be thinking about this component of encoding and decoding, which he will dive into deeper as he looks to also articulate and also to highlight ways in which we have these exchanges in certain scenarios. Doc?
Thanks, Keith. Hey, so this next portion is very intentionally going to bridge between Keith's and Natalie's portions, right? So I'm going to be reflecting back a little bit on what Keith has shared so far, and then be doing some foreshadowing. You're going to hear some concepts explained in slightly different ways. And again, that's also very intentional because people connect with concepts in different ways. And so we want to encourage you to latch on to whatever approach, whatever language really resonates for you so that you get something out of it. So Keith just discussed the idea of encoding and decoding that takes place during communication. One of the ways that we in the performance psychology department talk about this is the idea of filtering and the filtering that takes place so often in communications, right? So we start out with what is meant. Like if I'm a coach or I'm a leader and I'm attempting to convey some information to someone, I typically have an intention. I know what I mean to say. And there can be a difference between what I mean and what actually comes out of my mouth or my fingers if I'm typing or swiping or whatever, right? So that there's that, what I mean and what I actually say. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then we switch over to the other party, the recipient of my comments, right? So the next step is what is heard. Like I say something, you hear a version of it, not necessarily the whole thing, and not necessarily the whole thing with my original intent. From what you hear, you make sense of it, and you take something away from the conversation. That's the what is retained piece, which is in our last block there. Now, if you could go ahead and hit that next one. Thank you. All right, so now as humans, we all filter, right? Maybe not every time, but we do filter. We also miss stuff. Like if we're listening to really understand, maybe we don't miss as much. But if we're listening to respond, then the chances of missing some nuances goes up. Natalie, can you go ahead and populate the red box, please? Thank you. All right, so we also have a schema that works is at play here, right? Schema is basically a framework of understanding. We have a worldview that's constructed and it's elaborated over time. That schema influences how we transmit and what we receive. Right? For another day, there's also a really interesting mental model called the ladder of inference that I've used over the years, which shows just how easy it is to miss things, either through filtering, the confirmation bias, being selective just based on our schema. So if anybody's really interested in that model too, just reach out and I'll be happy to walk you through it. Reality is we can absolutely improve the situation by being curious. Right? This also links back to the growth mindset and adaptive thinking from yesterday. You know, quality questions can be a huge help. You know, here's some examples. Let's say, take a situation where we have a coach athlete sitting down in a film session. And some of you have heard me use these questions before. Like the coach can say, like, what do you see? This gives you an idea of what cues in the environment the athlete's picking up. We know experts pick up the relevant cues very fast. We know that novices tend to bounce around until they hope and find the cues that they're looking for. The next step is, what does that mean? This gives you an idea of whether the individual actually understands the cues that they're picking up. And then a third question could be, well, what do you do here? Right? Just to see if they understand the response, the proper response to a cue in the environment. This is giving you some insight into an athlete's sports-specific IQ. Right? And again, it comes from curiosity, because if you blow them up, if they get the question wrong, you're not going to get a whole lot of engagement in the future, right? So you want to pull them into this. On the other side, athletes who are talking with coaches or employees that are talking with supervisors can ask questions for clarification, confirmation, elaboration. Like, you want to make sure you're taking away the right stuff. And potentially you're really curious, so you want to elaborate on that and get a deeper understanding of what you're talking about. So we do all of this. We basically end up approaching full engagement, and that's really the goal of real high quality communication. Right now, to foreshadow a little bit of Natalie's portion, I'm going to start with one of my all-time favorite educational philosophers, John Dewey. I'm not going to read the slide to you. You can take a second here to read it. The reason that this is one of my favorite quotes of his is that I love the way that he uses the word attitude. Like I mentioned in an earlier session, the attitude is something we bring to the situation before anything happens. And then we get to select that attitude. We get to keep selecting it over and over again, right? So if we have an attitude of suspended conclusion, it means we realize there's more to the story than what we think we know. And we want to be curious about what else there might be, right? So as an attitude, it means we're predisposed to taking this approach all the time. Maybe not perfect, but it's what we want to do. Like, nobody has all the answers, nobody has all the knowledge. So if we're curious, we explore, we can evolve our understanding of really anything. So I want you to consider this suspended conclusion and this curiosity as we preview the concepts of intent and impact. Okay? Now, I usually see this written as intent versus impact, and it's a great way of looking at both. It really is. I'm offering up the word and instead of versus for a specific reason today. In many situations, especially in an organization that sees itself as a team, there are different responsibilities depending on your different roles. If you're transmitting information, you have a responsibility to know the person you're talking with to the extent that you have a good sense of what the impact is going to be. Good intentions aren't enough. We need to see the potential impact. And this is really hard. I've never met anybody who has fully mastered this. I screw it up all the time. I'm working on it. It's probably going to be a lifelong project. But as human beings, we're basically flawed creatures, and we're going to make mistakes. We just need to keep evolving. Now, in a team, the recipient also has a responsibility here. Like, their role is to seek the intent. And it doesn't mean that the impact is dismissed. It just means that there's an opportunity to see what was meant. There's also an opportunity to confront the difference between intent and impact. And I use the word confront because the root of the word is actually with front. Like, we have the ability, if we want to confront a situation together instead of confronting each other. That gives us an opportunity to explore the gap, to learn. Like, if we get really good at this, it leads to what I'll call championship communication. And I use that phrase because it fits nicely with what I shared earlier about championship mindset, thinking, and habits. So let's add championship communication to the language. Now, I'm going to share a couple of examples. First is a real life example, non-sport related. Second one is going to be a hypothetical example, sport related, right? So the first, the non-sport one. So many on this call that I've talked to over the last few years know that I spent the better part of 3 decades in the U.S. Army. Right. So as a veteran, we got Memorial Day coming up right around the corner. Like, it's a very somber day. It's not like Veterans Day where we celebrate people that are still, that have served. Memorial Day is all about remembering the people we didn't bring home. So in the different places I've lived, the neighborhoods, workplaces over the years, great people that I absolutely love to death, would sometimes greet me with Happy Memorial Day. And for years, like, that stung, because there's nothing happy about it for veterans, right? It's a somber day of remembrance. On my end, I had to learn to appreciate that it was coming from a really good place. People really meant well. They're great people. They just wanted me to have a good day. And I get it. So now I don't cringe. I just smile and I say thanks, you know. But there's another side of this, which I've experienced here in ICA, which I think is pretty special. There's a great colleague of mine. Every year he says, you know, I know what this day is about, and I'm thinking it. Very simple, but great. It's just a great message. There's another colleague of mine here who has literally become one of my closest friends in the world. Last year said, I'll paraphrase it, but basically said, I can't imagine what this day is like for you, but if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to learn some more. And I'm telling you, that was powerful, because we were able to have a really good conversation. So that's the real world, non-sport related. Now let's look at a hypothetical. Coach athlete, right? So let's say we got a coach somewhere in the Penn State system who has a particular worldview, really wants to be connected to his or her athletes. So they connect on social media, right? They're following each other and all that stuff I'm not real good at. Then the coach reacts to something that a friend posts, and then either, you know, responds to it or reposts it or retweets it or does something else with it, gets it out there in the public. And it's just something that came from a friend that they agreed with, but in a knee-jerk reaction, they throw it out there without taking a moment to think about how his or her athletes are going to feel about it. So, you know, it could be something as simple as, let's say it was a pro-police tweet, but the coach forgets that he or she has an athlete on the team that has suffered from racial profiling or worse. Maybe it's an anti-police post, but there's an athlete on the team that's got relatives in law enforcement. I mean, especially for people in positions of authority, the unintended consequences of a knee-jerk moment without thought of impact can be devastating to a team or to an individual on the team. So taking that moment to pause, reflect, and be intentional can go a long way. And it takes a lifetime to master. Like I said, I have screwed this up more times, not so much social media, but just in person. But it is really important to work on. And it's gotten worse in the 21st century with the speed and pace of communication, or at least throwing stuff out there. Maybe it's not communication, but the social media behaviors is just instant reaction, and it doesn't have to be. We can pause and think through it, right? So we could go on and on here with different ways, different examples, and so forth. The big point I want to emphasize here is we have opportunities for everybody who's involved in the conversation to seek the understanding of both intent and impact. And if we do that, it allows us to grow as individuals. It allows us to grow together as teams. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie in just a moment. Actually, got to have one more Revis puzzle here from Keith, but Natalie's got some unbelievable information and strategies to share that can really bring us home strong. So final puzzle here. And we can go ahead and put the answer up. There's no ones to blame. So we got 2 blames and we got no ones up there. And with that, Natalie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Carl. And since we're talking about communication, I have heard you that I'm presenting in the wrong mode. I'm going to ask for help and ask, does anyone know how to present in the correct mode? Because I'm very sorry that you've been looking at our notes and presentation mode. Anna, thank you for acknowledging that. I know that it's hard to interrupt someone. I was just having trouble managing it while I was trying to advance. Does anyone have an idea? Nicole, I know you had to toggle back and forth between them during our presentation.
Sure. Are you using 2 screens?
Yeah, I've got a couple screens. So just hit the other screen.
Hit screen 2. Yep,
Okay,
that should put it
thank
up.
you so much. I really
Perfect.
appreciate that. I'm like, here we are talking about communication. I have heard you. I appreciate your acknowledgement that I'm not communicating accurately, and I really want to correct that. So, and the spirit of course correction. And thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Carl, for cluing me in that was not the way it needed to be. So, you know, this is a group effort, right? Like no one person is ever to blame when communication is going awry, and yet we all have a responsibility to change it, to do something different. So you let me know when perhaps I'm not communicating accurately, and then I say thank you, and I lean into that, and I try and do better, and vice versa. This is sort of the contract we're all engaged in together. I'm going to start you with just a little bit of reflection. So think in your own life about who are the best communicators that you know. Could be people in your actual life, could be, you know, an NFL coach. It could be someone who, you know, who's a media presence. But what are the characteristics that allow them to be a great communicator, to be able to give and receive communication effectively? Thinking in your own life, who do you struggle to communicate with? You know, I have 3 kids, and I'd say that answer changes daily. Like, who am I struggling to communicate with today, and why and how? What do I wish I could be doing differently to communicate more accurately? And if you could choose one thing that you can think of that would change everyone's ability to communicate and it would improve it, what would be that one skill? You know, if I had to choose one, I would probably go back to Keith's slide around listening and say, oh, if we could just suspend our reaction for a little bit, just that little pause to really see what someone might actually be asking for or needing, I imagine we could all be more accurate communicators and improve all of our relationships. I like to say to people, you can't not communicate. And I know the double negatives can kind of mess me up sometimes too, but basically we're always communicating. And when you think that you're not, it would be interesting to ask someone what they were picking up from your non-communication or your perceived non-communication. So we like to say that these are just some general principles around communication. So communication is inevitable. Everything I do is a form of communication. You know, these little micro expressions we make on our faces. I'm sure you've met somebody who smiles, but not with their eyes, like they're just kind of smiling with the bottom part of their face. And doesn't that feel different than someone who's smiling with their whole face and kind of showing you how welcome you are in a space? Silence is a form of communication. I like to say, have you ever given someone the silent treatment or had someone give you the silent treatment? Most of the time that person is telling you something. And so we've placed a quote here for you that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And every, you know, retirement or goodbye dinner I've ever gone to has made me very aware of this statement that people really never forget how you made them feel. And if your players are telling you that, you know, you made me feel welcome or you made me feel like I was part of something, that's what we're all really looking for. Everyone wants to feel like they matter. And so if I could, you know, leave you with one quote after today, this would probably be my favorite one. So how much of communication is actually nonverbal? We tell beginning counselors this information because it's really important, that about 70 to all the way up to 93% of communication is nonverbal. Most of the time, people are paying way more attention to the way I'm saying something, how congruent my body language is with what I'm saying, than they actually are with my verbiage. And so sometimes if someone walks away from a conversation, you might just kind of be like, oh, hold on, you know, can I just check in with you? What did you take away from what I just said, which was Carl's advisement earlier? It's really interesting what people might take away. They might say, oh, I took away you were really distracted. You know, I took away that you must be having a hard day because you look tense, as opposed to the actual content of your conversation. I don't think this is any surprise to those of you that work in athletics, that what happens on that field of play, how much of it is actually nonverbal. I watch, you know, I watch a lot of soccer games with my husband, who's a huge soccer fan. And we always comment on how the soccer coaches will stand on the side and they don't appear to be doing very much, but they're communicating huge narratives to their team just by their arm fold, just by their glance. And we really admire that at like how emotionally intelligent athletes are to be able to gather all that information from just a glance, like from just a look over here. So fascinating to kind of watch some after game commentary and really dissect micro expressions that you'll see on coaches' faces. And if you go to this link later when you have the slides, it'll pop up to a video, but at the bottom of the page, it shows what some players agreed was the most important thing for them with their coach's communication. So they said communication, trust, connectivity. Those were these key components that made them want to be coached by someone. So we're kind of taking it all the way back to what we talked about at 1 o'clock yesterday with inclusivity. And then when you feel connected to your team, to the group of people you're with, that's what makes you really want to look up and kind of have that championship experience that we're all striving for here. So what are some components of true and effective communication? I think suspending our need to think about what our response is going to be is one of the best things we can do to be a true and effective communicator. I know it's really, really hard to not think about what I'm going to say. So a strategy we use with more beginning counselors is to think about how you would summarize what the person who's talking has said. So instead of thinking about what I want my response to be, I'm actually going to think about how I would give back to them what they've just said to make sure they know that I've heard them. The fast food principle of communication is another one of my favorites. I eat way too much fast food, or I have in my lifetime. And when you go through the McDonald's line and you order something and say, okay, I want a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke, what's the first thing the person on the other end says back to you? They say, okay, so you wanted a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke, right? Okay, so that's great. This is how much it costs. If what's on your screen's correct, pull around or whatever. And I think that fast food principle of communication, like, let me just real quick make sure that I got you on this. That will lead to much, much more effective communication in every relationship. You know, this works with your in-laws as well as with your athletes and your colleagues. So I really implore you to just think about that next time someone is saying something and you want to make sure you're deepening that conversation. And then for you to look for alignment between the physical self, that expression, and then what the person is saying. So a lot of what Keith just said about like, oh, I love you guys, you know, how genuine did you really feel love coming through that conversation? We're allowed to kind of ask if something feels like it's a little bit off. I remember professionally, one of, you know, an old supervisor one time just said to me, oh, you know, you okay? You look like someone took the wind out of your sails. And really, there wasn't anything verbally I had done. I was doing my work, all was fine. But she just noticed like that something felt a little bit like off. And she commented on it. It was, again, back to that Maya Angelou quote. I will never forget feeling like, oh, she really sees me. Like I matter in this moment. And all I did was be like, yeah, I am kind of having a hard day, but like appreciate you checking in. That small thing can really be the difference, I think, in feeling included and like you matter in the teams that we're a part of. So how about when impact and intent are misaligned? So I want to just talk about that inevitable experience we're going to have when it doesn't go perfectly, because I know we're striving to do a really good job in our experiences daily, but it's not always going to go well. And like Carl said, I'm trying, like I'm doing this every day. I'll put myself in that category of like every day I'm trying to do better than I did yesterday. So really typical in conversations, especially when there's a lot of intersectionality among identities. This happens, I think, also when we might not have a lot of historical knowledge of someone. I say cross-cultural communication is really, really complex. And I just put period because it just is. It is really complex. And if we ever try and simplify it, I actually think we're getting further from our goal. So an oversimplification of cross-cultural communication might be someone saying, I treat everybody the same. Like I do everything the same every single time and I expect, you know, it to go well. I think that might be an oversimplification. It might lead us not where we want to be. And I especially think because you're all dealing with teams daily, Group communication is challenging. It is so difficult to reach everyone in the same way. It can be a little bit of data overload for your own mind, because most of the time you have to be imagining what they're all potentially thinking. And we can only really do that for about 7 people at a time. Over that, it can kind of become a little bit of overload. So checking in that you're reaching people and using what Keith talked about, different ways to reach different people. Sometimes you're going to need to throw something up on the board. Sometimes you're going to need to say it. Sometimes you're going to need to communicate it, like, let's get out there and do something with our bodies to really drive this point home. And then meta communication, that's just communicating about communicating. So I like to let people know that I'm going to check in with them on how our communication is going over time. I don't want that to seem strange to them, because I really want to make sure that we're communicating accurately to each other. So I'm going to check in. That's meta communication, and I encourage you to do those pieces as well. And when you have a miss and the impact feels injurious, I think about those as those moments where microaggressions can happen, where we might unintentionally have kind of a conversational like fender bender, and somebody is injured. And so what are we going to do in that moment to get things, again, like get our train at least moving back on the track where we want it to be? What happens when someone lets you know that perhaps you haven't communicated accurately, or they've been hurt by something that you've said or something that someone else has said? These are really common responses when people get alerted to a microaggression. Sometimes people will want to minimize it and be like, I don't know why you're making such a big deal. You might say, that really hurt me. And they, this is why. And they might say, well, I just don't think that's true. Like, I don't agree with your hurt. That really hasn't been my experience or others people's experience on this team. Like, I identify in a similar way to you, and I just haven't had that experience. Or I make that joke with my friend all the time. Like, I make that joke with, I have tons of girls who are my friends. I make those jokes with them and they don't seem to care. But I think probably the most common response to getting alerted to a microaggression is silence. Most of the time, people really don't know what to do. And so I'm going to give you a couple techniques to try and make sure that your response isn't silence, because we've already established that is a form of communication. And that can really say a lot to the person who's experiencing your silence. So here are some different responses. Trust someone's experience. I could no more know what your feeling is than know if you're cold right now. If you're comfortable in your space. And if you were to tell me you're cold and I were to say, well, I'm really hot because I've got a lot of sun coming in right now, that storm seems to have passed, that would just be silly. I could never know what your emotional experience is. So I always say, start from the place of trusting someone's experience, especially if they're experiencing marginalization, which is really how we're talking about microaggressions right now. If you're the person that had a negative impact, speak up. Just claim what happened. If I have a fender bender on the road, that's really my first move. Like, I am so sorry. I did not see you there. I didn't intend for that to happen. Can we kind of get what we need to now to get us moving in the right direction? Can we exchange insurance information or whatever? Be mindful of the ways that microaggressions can happen everywhere. I think Carl's previous example about social media is a great one. We just never know when we hit send who that recipient is going to be or who might get forwarded that information. It just happens all the time, in the elevator, on the bus, on the way to a game. And then challenge yourself. I like to think, like we talked about yesterday, of mitigating bias, of having more equitable groups, as not ending, but progressive. Am I doing better than I was doing 6 months ago? Have I been alerted to, a microaggression and responded in a way that I'm more proud of than I may have? So this is something that I created with some people who I work with when we were presenting on microaggressions. So there's not really a citation, just something to kind of consider for yourself. And what we did was we just used the acronym REPAIR to try and think about how you heal from a microaggression, how you make it different than that injury. So relate as a human, stop all other tasks. Just like Keith mentioned, if you have a phone on the table in the middle of a conversation, it will decrease the vulnerability of both participants in the conversation markedly. So whenever possible, if you can go ahead and just put your phone away, that will help you relate as a human and keep you from being, so distracted, which is really difficult. And I'm now noticing that I wear a smartwatch. I'm needing to kind of do both. Like, how can I silence my smartwatch and make sure my phone isn't here and make sure my other monitor isn't dinging, all of those kind of pieces. Eye contact when it's culturally appropriate, check in with yourself. Like, is this a person who typically likes to make eye contact? Would that feel okay? Might that feel offensive? But make eye contact. Pardon yourself. So acknowledge and genuinely apologize when needed. But I wrote, check your goal. I really want to make sure I'm not making anyone who I've already injured responsible for making me feel better. That is not their job. My job is to acknowledge I did something and apologize, but then that's where it ends. No one needs to kind of like bless me for doing something that hurt them. Ask if they want to share anything back with you. I am aware that this happened. Is there anything you wanted to let me know? Initiate a listening posture. Remain non-judgmental. So one of my favorite techniques is something called willing hands, which basically means on your lap, just opening your hands to keep them from being kind of tense or tight, or keeping your upper body from being tight. Willing hands is a Marshall and a hand DBT strategy to just help you kind of remain non-judgmental and open. And then remember how that felt in the future. Let it soften and shape you and not define you. It was a behavior. It is not who you are. And really trying to remind yourself of that on this path toward greater, equity and inclusion, that we're going to not do it perfectly, and perfection is not the goal. Successful approximations of the desired behavior is the goal, which I know we are all aware of because we're constantly training our bodies to do those things too. So I'm going to chat with you about one more model in case you didn't love that repair model or it was a lot to remember, which it is. I like the VCR model. For those of you old like me who know what a VCR is, this was easy for me to remember. For those of you newer people who only remember DVDs, VCR might not come immediately to mind. So this is a Hardy technique: validate, challenge, request. A little easier to remember, just as useful. So I'll give you a quick example. I'm Latina, my family's from Mexico and Argentina. My grandfather came to this country and immigrated here. He made it to about third grade. Before he came here, he, did a couple of odd jobs, basically eventually ended up being a cook. That was his job. Great man, clinically deaf, had a lot of barriers in his life. And he's someone who I'm really proud to call my family. And I was talking to a friend here in town, someone who's lived here for a long time since she went to college. And I just said to her offhand, oh, hey, didn't you work at Irving's when you were in college? I love that place. And she said, yeah. And every day I'd leave smelling like a dirty Mexican. And I was horrified. Inside, that was a really hard microaggression to kind of experience. It was a microaggression because she had no idea my history. She had no idea that would be something that would really impact me so tremendously. And yet it did. So here we are right in that chasm of intent versus impact. She thought we were going to have kind of a joining experience about what a tough job she experienced in college. So validate. Let her know, I'm sure that you did not mean to offend me just now. I'm positive that wasn't your intent a second ago. Challenge. I want to just remind you, my family, where we come from, I'm Latina, this was my experience. And I imagine other people you talk to in your life also have their intersecting identities and could be offended by what you shared, even if they don't identify as Latina. They could be really offended by what you just said, and stay really concrete. You are not a terrible person, but this was something that really bothered me that you shared. And then request. Whenever possible, leave them with something they can do to build that skill. So that's really the way I think that the VCR model can kind of come together as an example. I want to leave you with a really helpful thing that we had kind of given a nod to when Sandy talked around micro affirmations and micro validations, because it can be, I think, tempting sometimes to spend all this time thinking about how we don't want things to go and spend little to no time talking about what we do want. And really what I want for you and all of the spaces where you're spending time is to think about how you want things to be. And micro affirmations and micro validations are the sort of antidote to microaggressions. They're these apparently little acts that can be kind of hard to quantify, but again, are cumulative. They happen in these private spaces for you. They happen on social media, I'm sure. They happen on the bus in that same way that the other events happen. But it occurs anytime you're helping other people succeed, have experiences of inclusivity and inclusion, honoring diversity. Anytime you do those things, and anytime you validate someone and let them know they matter, those are your micro validations that I think are going to create the framework of what we all want for the teams to be successful and have that championship experience that we've been talking about this whole summit. So I'm going to be happy to take questions later, but I know that we have one more activity, which I'm really excited to see. And so I'm going to send it over to Keith to do our last part.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Carl, as well as Natalie. And we're going to attempt some Zoom group magic right now. So simply based on what you see on the screen right now, and then we're going to stop sharing the screen because I want everybody, to the best of their abilities, make sure you turn your cameras on, get on the screen together. But I need you to seek out a standard size sheet of paper, whether it's a notebook piece, whether you got a piece of printer paper. You know, I want everybody to make sure they got a piece of paper. And then I'm going to lead you through a little exercise to try and illuminate and bring home some of the things that we've talked about today. So, Ms. Natalie, if you can stop sharing our screen, and we got everybody got these screens? Everybody got a piece of paper? Let me see if you got a piece of paper, because I know people be in here cheating all the time, and don't want to be participative. Thank you. Let me see that. Okay, we got it. We got it. I promise you, this will not be a wasted thing killing our environment unnecessarily. So the next thing I will ask you to do is, and that's why I wanted everybody to turn their screens on, is I'm going to give you some instructions, right? And I want you to follow along with the instructions. And here are two things. I need you to close your eyes as you take these instructions. And indicative of our society, you may not ask a question. Okay? So I need you to close your eyes and follow these instructions that I'm about to give you. So a little thumbs up as I'm scrolling through everybody's screen. Do we understand what we're being asked to do? Okay, outstanding. So here we go. Here are these instructions. I just need you to follow. The first one is I want you to fold your sheet of paper in half. Can't ask any questions. Tear off the upper right corner. Fold your paper in half again. Tear off the lower right corner. Fold your paper in half again. Tear off the upper left corner. And now I'm going to ask you to fold it in half one final time. And now tear off the lower left corner. I want you to remain with your eyes closed, and I want you to slowly unfold your paper. And after you unfold your paper, I want you to kind of hold it up in front of your screen, where we can all see each other, and open your eyes and show what your papers were looking like. And is it what you expected based on the instructions that you received? So as you scroll through, everybody's paper is looking a little bit different. Here's the thing, folks. We all received the same instructions though, right? But the way we interpreted it, the way we received the message looks completely different than potentially with what we heard. And this is a big thing in management, and I give a tremendous amount of credit to, Miss Sandy. And I remember she made a comment when I first started working here at Penn State is, that she herself was guilty of knowing what she has said, but did she necessarily circle back and check, and if that's what people heard? So in many ways, I hope that this drives home that thing of, if we all got the same instructions, then why did we all maybe interpret it a little bit different? And that just drives home that when you're dealing with individuals and you're dealing with human beings, that thing of connecting is so critical and so important. The intent, and as I love as Carl said, and impact, not intent versus impact. Right? I know what I said, but is that what they actually heard? And did I care enough to circle back and check? And I think that's one of the main things that Ms. Natalie also tried to drive home, is those micro affirmations, those micro validations. Even if we unintentionally injure somebody, do we circle back? Do we try and correct it? Do we try and get better? So we're gonna put one last thing back up on the screen, and I think it's for very good reason, and it's very apropos to make sure we finish with this. And then any questions that you have, you know, I know for Dr. Ohlson or for Dr. Natalie, but again, Maya Angelou. And I think after this presentation, maybe hopefully this quote maybe lands a little bit with a little bit more impact. I've learned that people forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, that we did not waste your time and we gave you some meaningful things to chew on and think about. And at the end of the day, we're all fallible. None of us are perfect. But we all can strive to be better communicators, to be the most effective communicators we possibly can be. Thank you, folks.
Thank you all so much for that. That was fantastic. You know, right now we'll open up the floor for any questions if anybody has anything or any comments.
I will say the McDonald's thing, the fast food, it does always resonate, but I get microaggressed because they say it's this all for one person. So, you know, I used to get offended when they asked if I needed 2 sets of silverware, and I was like, no, it's just me. But I'm learning to repair, Natalie. These people do that to me.
I once got a coupon for being such an efficient orderer for 5 people in my family. They're like, thank you so much for ordering so quickly. I'm like, I do this way too much. I used to say I was just on my way to get my family a healthy dinner. So there, no problem, Keith.
I would love to ask our participants that brave, like I said, our second day. And again, we can't say it enough. You know, Nellie, you and the crew, you know, doing the yeoman's work of putting this together, getting the word out and organizing all this. Thank you. But I ask, because of my role in working with our student athletes, whether you put it in a group chat or even if you want to come on your screen, do you have at least 1 or 2 takeaways around communication, of something that you maybe will take away or something that you maybe want to work on? I would love to get just some people's thoughts.
I don't work at the in ICA, but I love, you know, listening your experience and presentation for 2 days. I'm a faculty in Department of Kinesiology under College of Health and Human Development. In academia, it's pretty silos, and it's a lot of things going on, even though ICA, but it is nice to learn from your presentation and how can you utilize this in academia, in department, and also under college. And so thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
I think hello. I think, Keith, it allows me to focus more on listening more instead of trying to already formulate an answer before the person's message comes through. And I think a lot of times, you know, sitting as a head coach, we fight a lot of fires. So instead of always hearing and listening to what the kid has to say, or the young adult, we're already trying to maybe give a predisposed answer. And I think that can be hurtful at times and hurt the communication.
Outstanding, Coach. I appreciate that. I bravely call myself a smoke jumper, especially in most of our roles. We definitely are smoke jumpers. We got to make decisions and we got to get something done. And in sports, we always have that in the moment, thing as well, to where, it was said in the moment. But this has always, and what I even learned from Carl and even from Natalie was just, but how do you repair these things? And that's why I was very appreciative of what Carl and Natalie brought to the table today, is how do you repair these things?
Thank you.
Carl, this is Sandy. Could you remind me what you in your presentation you talked about suspending, and what I took out of it was suspending, preparing your response, which is what the gentleman was just talking about. What was the phrase?
It's the attitude of suspended conclusion, meaning you
Suspended conclusion.
to make this thing end, but rather you're suspending it because you realize there's more and you can't shortcut that. Like you can't finish somebody else's sentence and know that it's going to be accurate, that kind of thing.
And I'm thinking about it as a key element of listening to learn, to understand, as opposed to listening to respond.
It 100% all fits together, Sandy. Exactly.
And Keith, if you take that one step further, here we are today on May 26th, sitting here in our offices. Let's talk about if we're in our element of our sporting event, and now we're on a sideline and it's a bang bang play, and a kid's coming off, and now how do you react to hearing what they said and what you saw? And sometimes what we see from the sideline isn't exactly what happened in that moment, in that space where they're at, and you have to listen and you have to trust your kids at times. And I think that then creates better trust between coach-player relationship.
Absolutely, Coach. I learned the things. I come from a family of coaches as well, and the film don't lie. So I had a tremendous coach in college that he would not, like you said, even in the moment, but it was like, okay, we're gonna go back and look at the tape, and it taught me tremendous accountability as a student, as an athlete, because the tape don't lie. But our emotions, and to Carl's point, our thing is like, yeah, but I feel like you're injuring me in front of everybody else. I'm gonna have to defend myself. And how often does that happen? When in fact, I just learned to say, man, the tape don't lie, and we'll go back and correct it on the tape.
And Keith, to that point too, when you look at the tape and you do it from a perspective of teamwork and mutual growth, there's an opportunity for the conversation in there. And you can't do this all the time. Timing doesn't always allow for it. When a coach asks an athlete, what did you see in this situation? Right? Because this is what I see, this is what the tape shows, but what it doesn't show is what you saw and what you thought. That's useful information. Now, it doesn't come across the same as you say, what were you thinking? Because that's got some judginess to it. But what did you see that led you to this is a whole different kind of question. And it can really bring people together in the spirit of problem solving so that the next iteration looks different.
Right. Tremendous comments and questions. Does anybody have anything else we'd like to talk about? Carl, Natalie, Keith, thank you all so much. Fantastic presentation. Everybody that was a part of this, thank you. Everybody that attended, thank you so much. We had about 160 people register. Our high at one event, and we'll bring this up in the sports leadership team on who had this, but Sandy Barber won her crew with Natalie and Christina with 100 attendees. So that was exciting, but we averaged about low 70s. So that's exciting from a virtual standpoint. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do this more in person. In the coming days, we will be sending out just a quick little survey to everybody that registered. If you can just provide a couple little points of feedback on maybe how we can improve this next year, that would be really greatly appreciated. And then we've said it for the past 2 days, but oftentimes professional learning does not happen just in isolation, but over time with community and with context. So I would encourage you over the next year, don't let these conversations stop now. Engage with people on the screen, share contact information, and keep these conversations alive. If no one else has anything else, we'll end. I'll keep the meeting up. If people wants to exchange information, please do. If you need anything, let us know, and really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. Have a tremendous rest of your day.
Nellie, you still on? I think that's it, just us now. Muted.
Yeah, we're probably safe to close it out, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I think Mike's got his hands full already with track, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I think it went well. We can definitely improve it. Hopefully next year we'll be in person. But.
Well, this is the, I think this is the first that really it was this performance team doing the presenting throughout. But the feedback that I'm getting, and stuff is really positive. And if you look at this chat stuff, there's definitely people that needed to hear. One of my colleagues, Angie Pfeiffer, I can't remember if you met her or not, but she used to work for me at West Point. Well, not for me, but she worked. Great friend, great colleague, amazing professional in the field. And she was really excited to see the model that we use and how we go about business. Like, she's known that because we've talked about it before, but that really, she's really happy about that. She's also a Penn State alum and very proud of what we're doing.
That's awesome.
She's contracted to work with Track because they wanted an independent contract, and there's nobody better in the field to give to Track than Angie. So it's good feedback.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, we'll just make it better a little bit at a time.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
All right. Well, appreciate everything, Carl.
Yeah, thanks for leading this train here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right.
Have a good night, man.